Shogun's attention to historical authenticity has been the main selling point of the show, even more so than the physical scale of its production or the sweeping drama of its characters. Producer and star Hiroyuki Sanada basically put together a crack team of jidaigeki experts, and on set he personally checked and adjusted every single acting choice, every single thread of clothing to be as accurate as possible, right down to the natural vegetation and the way characters walk or dismount a horse. The show's chief historian, Dr. Frederick Krenz, features heavily on the podcast to basically flex Shogun's scholarly bona fides. It's so damn refreshing to get a series that respects its audience enough to approach a historical period without the need to smother it in modern affect. From the time they signed on to the project in 2018, the mission statement from showrunners Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo was to create a faithful and respectful portrayal of Sengoku-era Japanese culture. But when they sent in early drafts of the script to consulting producer Mako Kamitsuna, she responded, "I can't give a note on this, because a Japanese person wouldn't even think this way in this period of time." Even with the best of intentions, Kondo and Marks still had their work cut out for them. COVID completely derailed the production schedule on a show that had been announced way back in 2013. But quarantine proved to be a strange blessing for the writers, and they set out to completely rebuild their scripts, line by line, to do actual justice to the historical setting. No joke, they took the dialogue, written in English, translated it into Japanese, had a playwright who specialized in jidaigeki punch it up to make it more poetic and period accurate, then a Japanese producer translated those lines back into English, and then worked with Kondo and Marks to shape them into the final script. Additionally, almost all the Japanese character names were changed in the book to reflect proper Sengoku naming conventions, such as the suffix no kata, literally meaning of the or from the, added to the titles of the noblewomen. Keep in mind that all this fastidious work won't be appreciated by 99% of the people watching outside of Japan. That painstaking minutia is indicative of where Shogun 2024 excels at, where other adaptations failed.
Shogun, the love story. Shogun on Broadway. Directed by Michael Smuin at the Marquis Theater. You'll love it. Call Ticketron.
Language. That's the reason 70% of the show is in subtitled Japanese rather than having a complete English dub on default, like some other streamers. Netflix. There is a trust that the audience will approach the series on its own terms, because language is such a fundamental part of Shogun as a narrative. The story is set at the dawn of globalization, where fluency in the languages of the major colonial players was just as important to survival on the high seas as sales and supplies. The protagonist, the English ship pilot John Blackthorne, is a polyglot who speaks English, Latin, Dutch, as well as the languages of his queen's enemies, Spain and Portugal. Though once he hits the alien shores of Japan, his life now hinges on the words and whims of Japanese-speaking translators, most of whom are aligned with the very enemy he sought to plunder. Both the show and James Clavell's original novel brilliantly characterize these translators by the specific choices they make in interpretation. Take Father Alvito. He has to build a trust with the heretic Protestant Blackthorne that he will give a fair and accurate translation to the powerful daimyo Lord Toranaga. In the coolest depiction of linguistics since the 13th Warrior, Alvito gives such a precise conveyance of words that he eventually fades in the edit, leaving the English sailor and the Japanese lord carry on a seemingly natural back and forth conversation.
There are two Christian religions, Protestant and Catholic. We English are Protestant. Yes. Though I won't know for sure till I'm dead.
By barely using even his own words, Alvito reveals himself to be extremely intelligent, quietly compassionate even to his most bitter enemies, in a vital bridge between two worlds. And unlike literally every other character in Shogun, he's someone who takes the commandment of "thou shalt not bear false witness" dead seriously. But as much as he's dedicated to the Christian faith, he's also hyper-aware of his place as a tool for empire and commerce, and as we see later on, is not above using both for his own spiritual agenda, a reflection of Blackthorne's eventual place in this strange new land. One of Alvito's converts, Mariko, sits on a cultural fault line, serving 3 different lords. As a samurai, she pledges fealty to Lord Toranaga, acting as liaison in his dealings with the Portuguese and the many high-ranking women in the realm. As a wife, she endures her marital duty to her abusive husband, Buntaro. And as a Christian, she prays before the Lord God Almighty, entrusting her immortal soul to Father Alvito in the Catholic Church. Then this loud, unwashed barbarian arrives as basically the Western ideal of self-interest in the Age of Empire, and he's kinda weirdly hot, which causes Mariko to think of her duty to herself as an individual. With all the personal passions and desires she keeps hidden away behind her eightfold fence. In the show, the Eightfold Fence refers to the psychological barriers a person, particularly someone who is Japanese, places around their innermost psyche, of which no one, not even those most intimate to them, can reach. It comes from an ancient poem, one of the earliest recorded in Japan, told from the perspective of the sea god Susanoo no Mikoto, who builds an impervious fortress to protect his newlywed wife from all cardinal directions. An eightfold fence I make, an eightfold fence to protect my wife, the eightfold fence of Izumo, where the 8 clouds rise. Quite fitting that Mariko only peeks open her own eightfold fence through the language of poetry. She exchanges verses with the even more inscrutable Lord Toranaga in a collaborative call and response form of Japanese poetry called ranga. In ranga, one person would compose the first 3 lines, usually themed around nature, and the other would complete the stanza with 2 lines of their own. For a samurai, skill with metaphor was just as important as skill with the blade, and Mariko wields her words like a perfectly balanced and sharpened katana. It's only in this duel of verses versus Mariko where the mighty Lord Toranaga, by his own admission, is truly bested. She is the daimyo's greatest soldier, in a war fought more with language and proclamations than with troops or weaponry. The linchpin of his grand plan is revealed to be a deceptively simple piece of open-ended poetry created by Mariko, which causes her childhood friend Lady Ochiba to truly confront the long-stirring grief and resentment she held for the death of her father. Ochiba then gives her tacit support behind Toranaga's bid for Shogun, if not for any goodwill towards the daimyo. History bears out that her and her son will eventually clash against him, but out of appreciation for the steadfast purpose Mariko had lived her life, that even her own death is an expression of transcendent, selfless beauty that a mother like Ochiba holds at her very core. Mariko is a little less poetic with Blackthorne. In fact, the show kinda de-emphasizes how much language shapes their relationship. In Shogun the novel, both are fluent in Latin, and at first it's a way for them to communicate without tipping off any Portuguese-speaking spies, but it quickly becomes their love language. James Clavell represents the spoken Latin in an early modern King Jamesy English. So Anjin and Mariko's flirtation has a Shakespearean sonnet vibe. That's pretty dadgum hot, I'm not gonna lie. The 1980 miniseries tries to incorporate that, but doesn't really make it clear that they're supposed to be speaking Latin, so it comes off as them randomly calling each other thee and thou for no apparent reason. It doesn't help either that Yoko Shimada is basically reading all her English dialogue phonetically, and has zero chemistry with Richard Chamberlain, or that Mariko as a character is flattened down to trite East Asian female stereotypes. Plus, because of the bizarre decision not to subtitle any of the Japanese characters, the adaptation excises much of the book's political intrigue, so you're stuck with an inert romance for most of the runtime. The 2024 series has kind of the inverse problem. Anna Sawai and Cosmo Jarvis have a believable chemistry with each other, but comparatively not a lot of on-screen time to express it. And sadly, that means no sexy Latin dialogue. Instead, we get a quiet, understated, but powerful rendition of the Lord's Prayer that transcends language and petty religious schisms, and posits that Anjin and Mariko are more spiritually connected than linguistically, hence why her parting gift to Blackthorne is her crucifix. Now, history buffs will way too happily interject that if Shogun was truly historically accurate, then all the Europeans should be technically speaking early modern Portuguese, the lingua franca of the region, instead of contemporary English. For obvious reasons, that was never going to happen in a big-budget American production. But I think the choice to not give even the spoken English a historical affect like they did with the Japanese dialogue in its own unintentional way reinforces the cultural friction at the heart of Shogun. The language of the samurai reflects the structure of their society: rigid, formal, ritualistic, but also very poetic, designed to convey respect, even if the intended message isn't necessarily respectful. From the perspective of the Japanese, the languages of the Europeans, by contrast, are as coarse and barbaric as their filthy clothes and unwashed hair. Though in fairness, sailors like Blackthorne aren't exactly speaking the Queen's English, or I guess in this case the King's Portuguese. In the semiotics of language and fiction, we associate the these and thous of Shakespeare and the King James Bible with royalty and high class, even though those were technically informal pronouns. Clavell uses those same archaic English words to convey that Blackthorne and Mariko are speaking an ancient and learned tongue. Meanwhile, more modern-sounding English, especially when it's drenched in vulgarity,
Oyo shall, and fuck yourself, you sniveling little shitbag,
is often coded as the speech of the common man. Cosmo Jarvis really accentuates that anachronism, playing Blackthorne as a cross between a feral, salt-crusted sea dog and a soccer hooligan. Those memes of him ranting about his favorite sports team aren't actually that far off, and like 90% of the show's comedy comes from the mannered Japanese characters trying to decipher his barbarian gibberish. However, the comparatively modern language of Anjin and the Portuguese also emphasizes their historical place as vanguards of modernity, or at least the European conception of it. Guns, global trade, colonialism, and even humanist philosophy. Hell, the namesake of Blackthorne's ship, Erasmus, was a major figure in 16th century religious and political thought. The conflict of Western and Japanese values doesn't quite come to a head within the historical scope of Shogun's narrative. The expulsion of Europeans from the islands came decades later. But it still brews internally in many of its players. In that regard, John Blackthorne is kind of a tricky character to adapt in 2024. James Clavell had a genuine admiration for Japan, and Shogun at its heart is a vicarious weeaboo fantasy, where a white guy becomes fully assimilated into a foreign culture by shedding his Western values. Yes, Blackthorne is based off a real English pilot who did become a samurai after years of service to the Shogun. But the show's writers didn't buy that his fictional counterpart could speedrun that process and completely integrate into Japanese society in the span of basically like 10 months. And so in the show, Anjin learns the Japanese language and samurai customs at a slower pace than he does in the book, and his arc as a character culminates much later in the story itself. In both versions, Blackthorne attempts seppuku in protest of the harsh treatment of the peasants, essentially a Christian compassion, acted upon in a Bushido way. The transformative moment for Anjin happens around the midpoint of the novel, even before he is able to properly converse in Japanese, and it reveals a moral conviction that lies deep down within the Englishman. The show moves Anjin's seppuku to the final episode, and it honestly works so much better dramatically. At this point, Blackthorne has seemingly nothing left to lose. His dream of returning to England with untold riches is now burnt down along with his ship, and Mariko, the one truly intimate connection he made in a world in which individual passion is locked away, is now dead. All for Lord Toranaga's play for power. And now the daimyo inflicts further suffering on the lower class, as a pretext to root out those disloyal to him. The verbal language of Japanese is not enough to convey Blackthorne's despair, and so he uses the language of ritual suicide. Blackthorne sees in Toranaga the ugly reflection of his own naked avarice and ambition, all the people he killed and pillaged just to reach the shores of Japan, and his scheme to use feudal politics to ultimately line his own pockets. This version of the pilot is decidedly not a good man, and his seppuku is every bit a self-destructive attempt to cleanse his soul before he's judged by God, as it is a sincere sacrifice to save the lives of Ejiro's peasants. But Toranaga has a different plan for Blackthorne, and he stays the blade. Whether the daimyo spares him as repayment for saving his life, or because he still needs Anjin as a political pawn, or if he's just keeping him around for shits and giggles, Toranaga ironically gives Blackthorne a very Christian redemption. By willfully and selflessly drawing himself so close to death, John Blackthorne is spiritually reborn. He lets go of the greed and grief that had imprisoned him, and accepting whatever fate or karma may come, and finding purpose and belonging in Ejiro, just as Mariko found her greater purpose after the disgrace of her family name. The whole white guy learns to live as a foreigner arc can easily come off as cloying, so it speaks to the quality of Shogun's writing that they were able to find an ending that feels honest to both the characters and the cultures they represent. Hell, the writing might be a little too good. The entire cast of characters is so fully fleshed out and well realized, one can't help but feel a little underwhelmed that a majority of them don't get any on-screen closure to their arcs. Though maybe trying to tie a nice bow around everything is counter to the almost poetic structure of the series. History has no true end, and at some point the fiction of this story will become our reality. The last scene is a perfect ellipsis. Blackthorne and the villagers and samurai of Ejiro putting aside any personal grudge to raise the remnants of the Erasmus from the harbor, while their lord looks out into a future in which his descendants rule over 200 years of peace. Weirdly fitting that a story built around language says its final statement without uttering a word.